at the end of November, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance marked their 30th anniversary with a gathering at Queen's Park in Toronto. David Lepofsky, chair of the organization, extended an invite to members from each political party to attend a panel in Queen's Park where members of the disability community could share their lived experiences in a lineup of speeches and provide feedback to each political party on how they have impacted the disability community. David Lepofsky is joining me today to tell us how the event went, what kind of feedback was given to the parties, and if any action has been taken by the parties. I'm your host, Grant Hardy, and you're listening to The Pulse. So when we last left you, the AODA Alliance was prepping to hold the community public hearings November 25th at Queen's Park. Can you tell me a little bit about the turnout and the media event that preceded the public hearings?
Well, the public hearings were to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the birth of the grassroots nonpartisan movement in Ontario to campaign to get a strong new disability accessibility law passed, the first in Canada. We formed on the 29th of November in 1994, when I was 37. I'm now 67. And having campaigned for a decade to get the law passed and then campaigned for 2 decades to get it implemented, we came back to Queen's Park, which is where we were formed, the legislature building for the Ontario legislature. And our goal was to bring public attention to the barriers people with disabilities face, but also bring it to the attention of politicians. So normally the legislature, if it has an issue it wants to deal with, holds public hearings and they invite the public to come in and speak to politicians. We did something different. We, as a community group, staged our own public hearings in the building, but we invited members of all the political parties to come and hear from us. And we had any number of people with disabilities, both in person and over Zoom, describe the barriers they're still facing in education, in transportation, in housing, in healthcare, in employment, in access to goods and services. And the stories were wrenching. The stories were not new to us who do this advocacy, but for many in the public, it still came as a surprise or shock to hear it brought together like this. There was a great deal of media coverage, both at that time, but also this came just a month and a bit before the pivotal date of January 1st, 2025. That's the date that the Disabilities Act had set 20 years ago for Ontario to have become accessible by. And we knew that that legislative deadline was coming up. And, of course, it came. And on January 1st, New Year's Day, people with disabilities in Ontario did not awake to an accessible province, but rather to a province full of barriers. So we've been very busy focusing on that issue since, and we've had a torrent of media coverage since then.
Yeah, so a few things just to cover based on that. I checked out the public hearings, and wow, there was just a massive disparity between the, trauma, maybe even, anger of the speakers with disabilities versus the cheerfulness, calmness of the politicians that, some of the people that presented at the beginning. I'm just curious, how do we reconcile this chasm between how things are going versus maybe how some of the people working in government think it's going?
The chasm between the barriers people with disabilities face and what the Ontario government's saying couldn't be deeper and wider. That day in the legislature, the minister responsible for accessibility, Raymond Cho, who's had the mandate to lead the implementation of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act for 6.5 years, pretty much a third of its lifespan and longer than any other minister. And he told the legislature that 88% of people believe that Ontario is accessible. Well, I don't know who they're talking to, but certainly not anyone who's ever lived with a disability or who's taken 30 seconds to look around our province and see the barriers in schools, in hospitals, in stores, in public transit, in workplaces. Barriers that aren't just physical barriers, information barriers, communication barriers, bureaucratic barriers, even legal barriers. So the disconnect that you're talking about is enormous.
Do you think that the public hearings, I mean, this has been going on for so long. I imagine, one day wouldn't sort of turn it around. But do you think that maybe the members of parliament took anything away from the public hearings to absorb, or do you notice like kind of a shift in how things are going since the public hearings?
Certainly not on the part of the government.
Yeah.
But it's rare in this kind of campaign that one day or one event changes the world. We're in for the long game. We always have been. And so these hearings were pivotal to the unfolding events in our campaign. Like, we knew that this deadline was coming up, and we've been running a countdown on it on social media for years. And we've been calling for an action plan by the government that would lead us to an accessible province. No government, no minister has ever provided one, like a beginning to end action plan. And so we knew that we were going to have to unveil some kind of strategy in the new year. Once we were at a point where we can say it is the new year, we've passed the legislative deadline, the government's failed to live up to its obligation, and people with disabilities are suffering the consequences. So we saw these hearings as a way very publicly to gather yet more input before we unveiled a strategy. And that new strategy we did unveil, and we unveiled it on the very first day that the legislature building was open to the public in the new year. The legislature itself was not sitting, but the building's open starting on the morning, of January 6th, Monday, January 6th. It's the Monday after New Year's Day. So what we did that morning is we held a news conference at the Ontario Legislature in Queen's Park, where we unveiled our strategy for the future. And what had happened was, earlier that day, we had sent a letter to all 4 Ontario political parties. We're nonpartisan, of course. We don't support or oppose any parties. The Conservatives, who are the government right now, the Liberals, the NDP, and the Green Party. And we said, given that we're now at a point where the legislative promise to people with disabilities has been broken, here's what we want you to do. We've needed a multi-year plan, a beginning to end plan. No one's provided one up till now, so we are. We call it the Accessible Ontario Pledge. And we ask all 4 of the political parties to make the pledge. And in it, it's a 10-point pledge. We detailed all of the major actions that need to be done, not only get us on track, but get us to the goal of an accessible Ontario. If not by the deadline that's passed, then as soon as possible after that deadline. Our position is that the Disabilities Act has not vanished. It's not gone away.
Yep.
Nor have the government's obligations, nor have we. Now, since then, one party, the Green Party, has made the Accessible Ontario Pledge, and we're waiting to hear back from the other parties.
Yeah. So I'm not even going to ask, like, if we're close to an accessible Ontario. We obviously are not all across Canada. So maybe we can talk a little bit about the strategy for 2025, the pledge that you mentioned. Like, where do you want to take your advocacy this year? Obviously, hope people will endorse the pledge that you mentioned, but I don't know. Are there kind of like some priority items that you'd like to advocate for this year?
No, we're careful. We don't pick one barrier over
Yeah.
another because that works to the disadvantage of some people with disabilities.
Yeah, I completely understand.
The Accessible Ontario Pledge is carefully written so that it doesn't leave any people with disabilities behind. It covers us all. And we're facing the following. In Ontario, we are required to have an election by a year from this June. But it's widely rumored that the current government, even though they have a majority and don't need to call an election, may call an election this spring a year or more early. In every election since 1995, we've asked every political party to make election commitments to people with disabilities on the accessibility issue. And so we've made it clear that we want, as a part of this election campaign, for each party to make the Accessible Ontario Pledge. But even if no election is called, we have a government in power right now, led by Premier Doug Ford. They campaigned in 2022 for a 4-year mandate to govern the province. They won it. They've got a 4-year mandate to govern the province. They are the government right now, and they are responsible for implementing this act. So we're turning to them saying, this is your job. Will you make this pledge? And we're turning to the opposition parties saying, you're in opposition, and even if there's no election, will you commit to support this pledge and to pressure the government to live up to it? And that's our core focus right now.
Yeah, it's good time for sure for hopefully gathering some additional support. I wanted to talk about just one issue. I completely understand not wanting to prioritize one issue versus another. That's totally reasonable. One thing that seems a little more pan-disability that's just kind of absurd is the debacle with the Armory Street Courthouse. Can you maybe tell me a little bit about why you're advocating so strongly for that, but also, like, what does it say about a society where people with disabilities can't even show up for court?
Well, why are we focusing on that courthouse? Because it is such a powerful illustration of the bigger problem we face. Some people think accessibility costs a lot of money. That's a stereotype. It's mostly wrong. But when you're designing a new building, if you build accessibility in, it costs little or nothing, and it can save money. Here we have a courthouse that the government built. It spent $1 billion on it, so it's not like they were short on change. But also, it's a fundamentally important building. It's a courthouse where people go for justice. Moreover, it's a new courthouse, so it's expected to last not for years, but for decades. We don't build courthouses very often, and when we build them, we expect them to last for a very, very long time. So you want to get it right. But it's also emblematic of the problems we face because the government can't say, oh, shucks, we never thought of those things that we pointed out. The video we released last August, which you can Google, if you go to YouTube and just search on $1 billion accessibility bungle, $1 billion accessibility bungle, you can see the video where I tour you through these accessibility screw-ups. The video depicts how we actually warned, and others warned the government before any shovels went into the ground about serious accessibility concerns with their plans. And they went ahead anyway. So it's illustrative of so many of these problems converging. And we don't point to it because one building is more of a priority over another, but rather because it's sort of it's an excellent illustration in one place of the mess that we've been having to deal with.
Yeah, it kind of stuck out to me, I suppose, because just on the one hand, the court is literally where you expect kind of like impartiality, equity, inclusion, but also kind of relates to something that really fascinates me about like the marginalization of people with disabilities in terms of justice. Like, whether you want to be a witness or, something's happened to you, you're kind of considering sort of filing an application. Like, yikes, this definitely doesn't help with a more inclusive society. Did you want to comment on that?
No, I was going to say, it's a criminal courthouse. So it's a place that nobody ever wants to have to go to, but accuse people who disproportionately are people with different kinds of disabilities, addiction issues, substance issues, and otherwise, and where have to come to defend their freedom, and where victims of crime who are disproportionately people with disabilities have to go to try to get justice. And so nobody's going there sort of happily because they want to.
Exactly. I guess that's where I was going with that too. Witnesses, like people who maybe do want to go there because they're trying to right a wrong or some kind of injustice. That really kind of marginalizes the community. I don't know if there's anywhere we can kind of go with that at this point, now that it's been built.
Well, there's two things. One of which is, as a result of criticism of the building before our video came out, the Ontario government belatedly hired two different accessibility consulting firms to give them feedback on, hey, what can they fix? I've given input to both of them. One of their reports came out and we got a copy of it, and it basically validated key things we'd been saying. The other report, if it's been delivered, we haven't seen it. We were promised that we would get a copy, but the last time I wrote for it, I simply got no answer. But I know from seeing a draft of the report that it found even more problems, including ones we hadn't identified. So one thing is fixing at least what in the building they can, which is all a waste of public money. It should have been done right the first time. The second thing is there should be accountability by those who made these decisions. And I've sat in the room with some of these people who are defending the plans as they were going forward and making bold promises, big promises about accessibility, and who could well be in the process of designing other infrastructure programs right now. And the third thing is there needs to be a major revamping of how the government does infrastructure programs. And that's part of the Accessible Ontario Pledge. So this doesn't happen again. And we're hoping that by shining the spotlight on this bungle, that there might be at least some more momentum in favor of the government fixing that, because they come up with more of these bungles. We or others will have our smartphones and ready to shoot another video.
Talking about kind of shining the spotlight on some of the accessibility inequities that are happening, I'm curious, have you noticed a difference in media coverage in the mainstream related to accessibility barriers? Maybe them taking things a little bit more seriously. It's like we're a little bit of a more powerful demographic. And do you think I don't know, is the representation enough now, or at least better?
I will tell you this. I wrote a memoir about the fight to get disability into the Charter of Rights 44 years ago in 1980. And back then, it was extremely hard to get media coverage on our issues. In the 90s, when we started fighting for the Disabilities Act, we got some coverage, but it was extremely hard again. My experience now is it's somewhat easier in that there's a new generation of journalists who are more receptive to seeing our issues as newsworthy. And also because we have technology we didn't have back then to make it easier to cover our stories. We could shoot our own video, deliver it online, and then a reporter could see it and go, oh my God, this is ridiculous, and then do a story about it. In the coverage of the New Year failure to comply with the Disabilities Act, if you watch some of the stories, you'll see clips from the day that the legislature in 2005 voted to pass the Disabilities Act and gave it a standing ovation. Well, the reason that reporters could include that clip easily is because we had it on video from way back then. We posted it on our YouTube channel. Yes, you can sign up for the YouTube channel for the AODA Alliance. I encourage you to do so. And we had a hyperlink to it in our news release. So reporters getting our news release could click on that link, see the video, capture it, and include it in their stories. We couldn't do that 30 years ago. We couldn't do that 20 years ago. And we certainly couldn't do that 44 years ago. What makes things a bit more, somewhat more difficult is that there are few journalists than there were. The media is under really significant downsizing.
Yeah.
If you go to Queen's Park, where there used to be any number of journalists in the building with offices in the building who were regularly there, there are far fewer. They come in to cover a news conference, but fewer do, are there physically in the building on a full-time basis. And newspapers are physically smaller than they used to be, much smaller. So we're competing in some cases for less and less space.
Yeah, that's totally fair. But at least maybe the topics of equity and diversity are a little more on the radar for people. I just wanted to ask you a couple quick other things. First of all, if you don't mind sharing, I always find the worst part of advocacy, feeling like you're banging your head against the wall, is mental health related. And I'm just curious, how do you kind of keep yourself grounded or maybe preserve your mental health?
I'm an eternal optimist, and I know we're in for the long game. And we at the AODA Alliance know that. So that, yes, bad news happens along the way. Yeah, lots of it does. And hearing the stories at our town hall our community hearings, public hearings, is wrenching. Listening to these and hearing the pain in people's voice, the frustration, the anger, is wrenching. But I'm driven forward by a number of things, one of which is we have platforms to get our word out. We could get a news release out, do a news conference, and in the case of our January 6th news conference, 4 TV networks covered it that night. CBC had us on 7 different radio shows the next morning. The video of that news conference, at the news conference, there were a handful of, I think about 4 reporters actually in the room, which isn't a lot. But the video is up on our website. You could go to the YouTube AODA Alliance channel, and you can see the video. In fact, 1,200 people have watched it. I can't believe it. We've never had that much coverage of just attention on a news conference. So I'm enthused by our capacity to garner an impact. The amount of feedback we get from people with disabilities and people without disabilities who universally share our frustration and think we deserve better. But the other thing that really motivates me, and probably more than anything, is the determination of individuals with disabilities and their supporters. meeting people, meeting the next generation. I teach at a couple of law schools on a part-time basis, meeting the next generation of disability advocates who want to learn, want to know how to do it, and want to get onto it, and aren't going to put up with barriers. Meeting people of all ages who aren't trained in advocacy, don't have professional designations, and yet they are ready to write letters to the editor, ready to go to public hearings, and ready to voice their concerns, call radio stations, and so on. That really motivates me, seeing the kind of energy there is there, and it's stronger than ever.
Really quick, David, what can lay people with disabilities do then to advocate?
The main thing I'm going to suggest is sign up, go to our website, which is www.aodaalliance.org. That's AODAalliance.org. On the home page, go down to the sign up link to sign up for our newsletters. We send out updates sometimes multiple times a week, and they virtually always have it. They'll update you on some new development, but they virtually always have a section called How You Can Help. And we give you action tips. And they're meant for you at home, busy, got other things to do. And we give you bite-sized action tips. We'll give you several. Any of them that you do, that's great. Do more than one, even better.
Yeah, it's really important stuff. So hopefully people can get involved. Thank you so much for your time, David. Really appreciate it.
Really appreciate you having me on the show.
David Lepofsky is a retired lawyer who has many awards and accolades. He has been awarded to the Order of Canada, Order of Ontario, and is in the Canadian Disability Hall of Fame. He joined me today to follow up on the 30th anniversary of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance and the gathering that was held at Queen's Park. As the AODA Alliance is continuing their advocacy to hold Ontario accountable for missing the AODA deadline of January 1st, 2025, visit their website at www.aodaalliance.org. The Pulse is available as a video podcast on YouTube at www.youtube.com/@thepulseami. I'm your host, Grant Hardy. Thank you for listening to The Pulse.